Hello there. My name is Austin, and I'd like to welcome you to Chapter 5 of The Picture of Dorian Gray. So far, we've seen Dorian Gray meet a few extra characters, that being Basil, the painter, as well as a young woman who he fell madly in love with at a very quick rate. We're about halfway through now, so let's see what happens. For some reason or other, the house was crowded that night, with the fat Jewish manager who met them at the door beaming from ear to ear with an oily, tremulous smile. He escorted them to their box with a sort of pompous humility, waving his fat jeweled hands and talking at the top of his voice. Dorian Gray loathed him more than ever. He felt as if he had come to look for Miranda and had been met by Caliban. Lord Henry, upon the other hand, rather liked him. At least he declared that he did, and insisted on shaking him by the hand and assured him that he was proud to meet a man who had discovered a real genius and had gone bankrupt over Shakespeare. Howard amused himself with watching the faces in the pit. The heat was terribly oppressive, and the huge sunlight flamed like a monstrous dahlia with petals of fire. The youths in the gallery had taken off their coats and waistcoats and hung them over the side. They talked to each other across the theater and shared their oranges with the tawdry painted girls who sat by them. Some women were laughing in the pit. Their voices were horribly shrill and discordant. The sound of the popping of corks came from the bar. "What a place to find one divinities in," said Lord Henry. "Yes," answered Dorian Gray. "It was here that I found her, and she is a divine beyond all living things. When she acts, you'll forget everything. These common people here..." Appears I forgot my drink. "These common people here, with their coarse faces and brutal gestures, become quite different when she's on the stage. They sit silently and watch her. They weep and laugh as she wills them to do. She makes them as responsive as a violin. She spiritualizes them, and one feels that they are of the same flesh and blood as oneself." "Oh, I hope not," murmured Lord Henry, who was scanning the occupants of the gallery through his opera glass. "Don't pay attention to him, Dorian," said Howard. "I understand what you mean, and I believe in this girl. Anyone you love must be marvelous, and any girl that has the effect you describe must be fine and noble. To spiritualize one's age, that's something worth doing. If this girl can give soul to those who have lived without one, if she can create the sense of beauty in people who have lives that have been sordid and ugly, if she can strip them of their selfishness and lend them tears for sorrows that are not their own, she is worthy of all your adoration, worthy of all the adoration in the world. This marriage is quite right. I did not think so at first, but I admit it now. God made Sybil Vane for you. Without her, you would have been incomplete." "Thanks, Basil," answered Dorian Gray, pressing his hand. "I knew that you would understand me. Harry is so cynical he terrifies me. But here is the orchestra. It's quite dreadful, but it only lasts for about 5 minutes. Then the curtain rises, and you'll see the girl to whom I'm going to give all my life, to whom I've given everything that's good in me." A quarter of an hour afterwards, amidst an extraordinary turmoil of applause, Sybil Vane stepped onto the stage. Yes, she was certainly lovely to look at. One of the loveliest creatures, Lord Henry thought, that he had ever seen. There was something of the fawn in her, shy grace and startled eyes. A faint blush, like the shadow of a rose in a mirror of silver, came to her cheeks as she glanced at the crowd, at the enthusiastic house. She stepped back a few paces, and her lips seemed to tremble. Basil Howard leaped to his feet and began to applaud. Dorian Gray sat motionless, gazing on her like a man in a dream. Lord Henry peered through his opera-glass, murmuring, "Charming, charming." The scene was the hall of the Capulets' house, and Romeo in his pilgrim's dress had entered with Mercutio and his friends. The band, such as it was, struck a few bars of music, and the dance began. Through the crowd of ungainly, shabbily dressed actors, Sybil Vane moved like a creature from a finer world. Her body swayed as she danced, as a plant sways in the water. The curves of her throat were like the curves of a white lily. Her hands seemed to be made of cool ivory. Yet she was curiously listless. She showed no signs of joy when her eyes rested on Romeo. The few lines that she had to speak. "Good pilgrim, you do wrong your hand too much. which mannerly devotion shows in this. For saints have hands that pilgrims' hands do touch, and palm to palm is holy palmer's kiss. With the brief dialogue that follows, were spoken in a thoroughly artificial manner. The voice was exquisite, but from the point of view of tone, it was absolutely false. It was wrong in color. It took away all the life from the voice. It made the passion unreal. Dorian Gray grew pale as he watched her. Neither of his friends dared to say anything to him. She seemed to them to be absolutely incompetent. They were horribly disappointed. Yet they felt that the true test of any Juliet is the balcony scene of the second act. They waited for that. If she failed there was nothing in her. She looked charming as she came out into the moonlight. That could not be denied. But the staginess of her acting was unbearable, and grew worse as she went on. Her gestures became absurdly artificial. She overemphasized everything she had to say. The beautiful passage, "Thou knowest the mask of night is on my face, else would a maiden blush bepaint my cheek, for that which thou hast heard me speak tonight," was declaimed with the painful precision of a schoolgirl who had been taught to recite by some second-rate professor of elocution. When she leaned over the balcony and came to those wonderful lines, "Although I joy in thee, I have no joy of this contract tonight. It is too rash, too unadvised, too sudden, too like the lightning, which doth cease to be, ere one can say it lightens. Sweet good night. This bud of love by summer's ripening breath may prove a beauteous flower when next we meet." She spoke the words as if they conveyed no meaning to her. It was not nervousness. Indeed, so far from being nervous, she seemed absolutely self-contained. It was simply bad art. She was a complete failure. Even the common, uneducated audience of the pit and gallery lost their interest in the play. They got restless and began to talk loudly and to whistle. The Jewish manager, who was standing at the back of the dress circle, stamped and swore with rage. The only person unmoved was the girl herself. When the second act was over, there came a storm of hisses, and Lord Henry got up from his chair and put on his coat. "She's quite beautiful, Dorian," he said, "but she can't act. Let's go." "I'm going to see the play through," answered the lad in a hard, bitter voice. "I am awfully sorry that I made you waste this evening, Harry. I apologize to both of you." "My dear Dorian, I should think Miss Vane was ill," interrupted Howard. "We will come some other night." "I wish she was ill," he rejoined. "But she seems to me simply callous and cold. She has entirely altered. Last night she was a great artist. Tonight she's merely a commonplace, mediocre actress." "Don't talk about that for anyone that you love, Dorian. Love is a more wonderful thing than art." "They're both simply forms of imitation," murmured Lord Henry. "But do let us go, Dorian. You must not stay here any longer. It's not good for one's morals to see bad acting. Besides, I don't suppose you will want to see your wife act. So what does it matter if she plays Juliet like a wooden doll? She's very lovely. And if she knows anything about life, as she does about acting, she'll be a delightful experience. There are only two kinds of people who are really fascinating people. People who know absolutely everything, and people who know absolutely nothing." "Good heavens, my dear boy, don't look so tragic. The secret of remaining young is to never have an emotion that's unbecoming. Come to the club with Basil and myself. We'll smoke cigarettes and drink to the beauty of Sybil Vane. She is beautiful. What more could you want?" "Please go away, Henry," cried the lad. "I really want to be alone." "Basil, you don't mind my asking you to go. Can't you see my heart is breaking?" Hot tears came to his eyes. His lips trembled, and rushing to the back of the box, he leaned against the wall, hiding his face in his hands. "Let us go, Basil," said Lord Henry, with a strange tenderness in his voice. And the two young men passed together. A few moments afterwards, the footlights flared up, and the curtain rose for the third act. Dorian Gray went back to his seat. He looked pale and proud and indifferent. The play dragged on and seemed interminable. Half of the audience went out, tramping in heavy boots and laughing. The whole thing was a fiasco. The last act played to almost empty benches. And as soon as it was over, Dorian Gray rushed behind the scenes into the green room. The girl was standing alone there, with a look of triumph on her face. Her eyes were lit with exquisite fire. There was a radiance about her. Her parted lips were smiling over some secret of their own. When he entered, she looked at him, and an expression of infinite joy came over her. "How badly I acted tonight, Dorian," she cried. "Horribly," he answered, gazing at her in amazement. "Horribly. It was dreadful. Are you ill? You have no idea what it was. You have no idea what I suffered." The girl smiled. "Dorian," she answered, lingering over his name with long-drawn music in her voice, as though it were sweeter than honey, to the red petals of her lips. "Dorian, you should have understood, but you understand now, don't you?" "Understand what?" he said angrily. "Why I was so bad tonight. Why I shall always be bad. Why I shall never act well again." He shrugged his shoulders. "You're ill, I suppose. When you're ill, you shouldn't act. You shouldn't make yourself ridiculous. My friends were bored. I was bored." She seemed to not listen to him. She was transfigured with joy. An ecstasy of happiness dominated her. "Dorian, Dorian," she cried, "before I knew you, acting was one with the reality of my life. It was only in the theater that I lived. I thought that it was all true. I was Rosalind one night and Portia the other. The joy of Beatrice was my joy, and the sorrows of Cordelia were mine also. I believed in everything. The common people who acted with me seemed to be godlike. The painted scenes were my world. I knew nothing but shadows, and I thought them real. But you came, oh, my beautiful love, and you freed my soul from prison. You taught me what reality really is. Tonight, for the first time in my life, I saw through the hollowness, the sham, the silliness of the empty pageant in which I've always played. Tonight, for the first time, I became conscious that the Romeo was a hideous, old, and painted, and that the moonlight in the orchard was false, and that the scenery was vulgar, and the words that I had to speak were unreal, were not my words, not what I wanted to say. You had brought me something higher, something of which all art is but a reflection. You have made me understand what love really is. My love, I'm sick of shadows. You are more to me than all art can ever be. What have I to do with the puppets of a play? When I came on tonight, I could not understand how it was that everything had gone from me. Suddenly it dawned on my soul what it all meant. The knowledge was exquisite to me. I heard them hissing and I smiled. What should they know of love? Oh, take me away, Dorian. Take me away with you, where we can be quite alone. I hate the stage. I might mimic a passion that I do not feel, but I cannot mimic one that burns me like fire. Oh, Dorian, do you understand what it all means? Even if I could do it, it would be a profanation for me to play a being in love. You've made me see that." He flung himself down on the sofa and turned away his face. "You've killed my love," he muttered. She looked at him in wonder and laughed. He made no answer. She came across to him and stroked his hair with her little fingers. She knelt down and pressed his hands to her lips. He drew them away and a shudder ran through him. Then he leaped up and went to the door. "Yes," he cried. "You've killed my love. You used to stir my imagination. Now you don't even stir my curiosity. You simply produce no effect. I loved you because you were wonderful, because you had genius and intellect, because you realized the dreams of great poets and gave shape and substance to the shadows of art. You've thrown it all away. You're shallow and stupid. My God, how mad I was to love you. What a fool I've been. You're nothing to me now. I will never see you again. I will never think of you. I will never mention your name. You don't know what you were to me once. Why, once, I can't even bear to think of it. I wish I'd never laid eyes upon you. You have spoiled the romance of my life. How little can you know of love if you say it mars your art? What are you without your art? Nothing. I would have made you famous, splendid, magnificent. The world would have worshipped you, and you would have belonged to me. What are you now? A third-rate actress with a pretty face." The girl grew white and trembled. She clenched her hands together, and her voice seemed to catch in her throat. "You're not serious, Dorian," she murmured. "You're acting." "Acting. I leave that to you. You do it so well," he answered bitterly. She rose from her knees and with a piteous expression and pain in her face came across the room to him. She laid her hand upon his arm and looked into his eyes. He thrust her back. "Don't touch me!" he cried. A low moan broke from her, and she flung herself at his feet and lay there like a trampled flower. Dorian, don't leave me," she whispered. "I'm so sorry I didn't act well. I was thinking of you all the time, but I'll try. Indeed, I'll try. It came so suddenly across me, my love for you. I think I should never have known it if you had not kissed me, if we had not kissed each other. Kiss me again, my love. Don't go away from me. I couldn't bear it. Can't you forgive me for tonight? I'll work so hard and try to improve. Don't be cruel to me because I love you better than anything in the world. After all, it's only once that I've not pleased you, but you're quite right, Dorian. I should have shown myself more as an artist. It was foolish of me, and yet I couldn't help it. Oh, don't leave me. Don't leave me. A fit of passionate sobbing choked her. She crouched onto the floor like a wounded thing, and Dorian Gray, with his beautiful eyes, looked down at her. His chiseled lips curled in exquisite disdain. There's always something ridiculous about the passions of people whom one has ceased to love. Sybil Vane seemed to him to be absurdly melodramatic all of a sudden. Her tears and sobs annoyed him. I'm going, he said at last, in his calm, clear voice. I don't wish to be unkind, but I can't see you again. You've disappointed me. She wept silently and made no answer, but crept nearer to him. Her little hands stretched blindly out and appeared to be seeking out for him. He turned on his heels and left the room. In a few moments he was out of the theater. Where he went to he hardly knew. He remembered wandering through the dimly lit streets, with gaunt, black-shadowed archways and evil-looking houses. Women with hoarse voices and harsh laughter had called after him. Drunkards had reeled by cursing and chattering to themselves like monstrous apes. He had seen grotesque children huddled upon doorsteps and had heard shrieks and oaths from gloomy courts. When the dawn was just breaking, he found himself at the Covent Garden. Huge carts filled with nodding lilies rumbled slowly down to the polished empty streets. The air was heavy with the perfume of flowers, and their beauty seemed to bring him an anodyne for his pain. He followed into the market and watched the men unloading their wagons. A white-smocked carter offered him some cherries. He thanked him and wondered why he refused to accept any money for them, and began to eat them listlessly. They had been plucked at midnight, and the coldness of the moon had entered into them. A long line of boys carrying crates of striped tulips and of yellow and red roses detailed in front of him, threading their way through a huge jade-green pile of vegetables. Under the portico, with its grey sun-bleached pillars, loitered a troop of bedraggled, bare-headed girls, waiting for the auction to be over. After some time he hailed a hansom and drove home. The sky was pure opal now, and the roofs of the houses glistened like silver against it. As he was passing through the library towards the door of his bedroom, his eyes fell upon the portrait Basil Hallward had painted of him. He started back in surprise, and then went over to it and examined it. The dim, arrested light that struggled through the cream-colored silk blinds, the face seemed to him to be a little changed. The expression looked different. One would have said that there was a touch of cruelty in the mouth. It was certainly curious. He turned round and walked through the window, and drew the blinds up. The bright dawn flooded the room and swept the fantastic shadows into dusky corners, where they lay shuddering. But the strange expression that he had noticed in the face of the portrait seemed to linger there, to be more intensified even. The quivering, ardent sunlight showed him the lines of cruelty round the mouth, as clearly as if he'd been looking into a mirror after he'd done some dreadful thing. He winced, and talking up from the table, an oval glass framed in ivory cupids that Lord Henry had given him, he glanced hurriedly into it. No line like that warped his red lips. What did it mean? He rubbed his eyes and came close to the picture, and examined it again. There were no signs of any change when he looked into the actual painting, and yet there was no doubt that the whole expression had altered. It was not a mere fancy of his own. The thing was horribly apparent. He threw himself into a chair and began to think. Suddenly there flashed into his mind what he had seen in Basil Hallward's studio that day the picture had finished. Yes, he remembered it perfectly. He had uttered a mad wish that he himself might remain young, and that the portrait would grow old, that his own beauty might remain untarnished. And the face on the canvas bear the burden of his passions and his sins. That the painted image might be seared with the lines of suffering and thought, and that he might keep all the delicate bloom and loveliness of his then just conscious boyhood. Surely his prayer had not been answered. Such things were impossible. It seemed monstrous to even think of them, and yet there was the picture before him with a touch of cruelty in the mouth. Cruelty? Had he been cruel? It was the girl's fault, not his. He had dreamed of her as a great artist, had given his love to her because he thought her great. Then she had disappointed him. She had been shallow and unworthy, and yet a feeling of infinite regret came over him as he thought of her lying at his feet sobbing like a little child. He remembered with what callousness he watched her. Why had he been made like that? Why had such a soul been given to him? But he'd suffered also. During the 3 terrible hours that the play had lasted, he had lived centuries of pain, eon upon eon of torture. His life was well worth hers. She had marred him for a moment, if he had wounded her for an age. Besides, women were better suited to bear sorrow than men. They lived on in their emotions. They only thought of their emotions. When they took lovers, it was merely to have someone with whom they could have scenes. Lord Henry had told him that, and Lord Henry knew what women were. Why should he trouble about Sybil Vane? She was nothing to him now. But the picture. What was he to say of that? It held the secret of his life and told his story. It had taught him to love his own beauty. Would it teach him to loathe his own soul? Would he ever look at it again? No, it was merely an illusion, wrought on his troubled senses. The horrible night that he had passed had left phantoms behind it. Suddenly, there had fallen upon his brain a tiny scarlet speck that makes men mad. The picture had not changed. There was folly to think so. Yet it was watching him, with its beautiful marred face and its cruel smile. Its bright hair gleamed in the early sunlight. Its blue eyes met his own. A sense of infinite pity, not for himself, but for the painted image of himself, came over him. It had altered already, and it would alter more. Its gold would wither into gray. Its red and white roses would die. For every sin that he committed, a stain would fleck and wreck its fairness. But he would not sin. The picture, changed or unchanged, would be to him a visible emblem of conscience. He would resist temptation. He would not see Lord Henry any more, would not, at any rate, listen to those subtle, poisonous theories that in Basil Hallward's garden had first stirred within him the passion for impossible things. He would go back with Sybil Vane, make her amends, marry her, try to love her again. Yes, it was his duty to do so. He must have suffered more than he had. A poor child. He had been selfish and cruel to her. The fascination that she had exercised over him would return. They would be happy together. His life with her would be beautiful and pure. He got up from his chair and drew a large screen right in front of the portrait, shuddered as he glanced at it. How horrible, he murmured to himself as he walked across the window and opened it. When he stepped out on the grass, he drew a deep breath. The fresh morning air seemed to drive away all of his somber passions. He thought only of Sybil Vane. A faint echo of his love came back to him. He repeated her name over and over again. The birds that were singing in the dew-drenched garden seemed to be telling the flowers about her. And with that, we're now halfway through our story. It took a while, but we're finally starting to see a few traces of the supernatural beginning to happen. We can only wonder what's going to happen next. Well, with that, I hope that you're tucked in, you're full, and that you have something to drink. Good night, and I'll see you next time.